Ri's supporters seized on the trusteeship issue to oppose the Moscow Agreement as a whole.
Those people felt that a joint administration of Korea by the Russians and Americans would lead to reforms that would undercut their power. In other words, there would have to be some sort of purge of collaborators with the Japanese, since the Russians were doing it in the north, and official American policy called for a purge. And there would have to be land reform. They opposed both of those things, and therefore the trusteeship issue gave them their first sort of patriotic issue, so they could say, I'm not a landlord, I'm not a collaborator with the Japanese, I'm a patriot.
Hodge, urged on by Preston Goodfellow, the intelligence officer who brought Ri back, came to rely more and more on the right. The US moved to set up a separate government in the south. There were also factional assassinations. The leading moderate, Yo Un-hyung, was murdered in 1947.
The result was that there was a definite strong-armed element in the rise of the right and of Syngman Rhee, although he also had great charismatic and speaking powers, and also was a very far-seeing politician in some respects.
There were repeated crackdowns against the left and moderates by official police, quasi-official gangs, and the occupation authorities.
The Communist Party in South Korea had substantial support. Actually, between 1945 and 1946 or even 1947, the Communist Party, I believe, was the best organized political force in South Korea. Had the Communist Party in South Korea played their cards well, South Korea probably would have been taken over by the Communist Party. They were too radical.
Violent battles were common in the towns and also throughout the countryside, with attacks on the much-hated police and landowners. There was hunger and poverty.
These were not a bunch of agrarian reformers or propagandists alone. They were a well-organized, thinking, intelligent group of people. And so things were getting worse out in the countryside. I declared war on the Communist Party. And so we started, and we put 3,000 communists and fellow travelers in jail.
In the north, the communists were not in jail, they were in power. Kim Il-sung was the center of a growing personality cult. He and his guerrilla colleagues stamped their radical authoritarian imprint on the country. They rebuilt the North's powerful industries and improved the position of women and education. Elections offered no choice. You voted for the official list in a white box or against in a black box. Few dared to use the black box. The regime's land reform won its support.
The land question was the central social question in Korea in the 1940s. That became the central fundamental issue, the social question, let's say, behind the politics of the period. The reason that land reform was at least a temporary success in North Korea was that the land was simply redistributed. It was a land to the tillers program. Tenants got the land they worked on, but the land was not collectivized.
Neither regime wanted to lose what it had. In the north, the Korean People's Army was founded in 1948. The regime killed some opponents and suppressed opposition in all forms. Opponents flowed south across the still open border. Christians, landlords, former collaborators in the police and army, and others who saw no future in the north. Others, dissenters and political refugees, went north. The two societies were reinforced by these exiles.
The repression on the religious people was getting much more severe. As I understand it, there was only Kim Il-sung University for senior schools. Whilst I was at Kim Il-sung University, I knew that as many as 500 people, religious people and students, were convicted and sent to Vladivostok.
그때는 이미 북쪽에서 많은 그 청년들이
At that time in North Korea, many youths opposed and fought communism and came south.
이 군정 하에서 남한의 상태라는 것은 엉망입니다.
The situation in South Korea under the rule of the United States military government was chaotic.
아주 그
The United States military government pursued the general appeasement policy which approved both communism and democracy. And this created great disorder in the whole of South Korea. Unable to rely on the US military government to restrain communism, we formed the Northwest Youth Corps and carried out terrorist activities.
In 1947, the Russians were back in Seoul for a last attempt to reach agreement on a unified Korea. They proposed simultaneous withdrawal of forces by the Americans and themselves, but the Americans declined and turned instead to the infant United Nations over Soviet protests. A UN Commission on Korea was set up. The Russians refused to recognize it or to let it into the North. The UN was then pro-Western. It voted for elections in the South on American urging.
Those resolutions mean, in essence, that the United Nations is going to try to break the deadlock which has developed in Korea, and which for now 2 years has prevented the achievement for Korea of the independence.
Canada and Australia voted against.
The issue was whether there would be a separate election in the South alone. And my instructions were that we should resist an election in the South alone, because if there was an election in the South alone, you would end up with a government for the South alone. And indubitably, you would have also then a government in the North for the North alone, possibly both claiming to represent the whole of Korea.
Kim Il-sung was quick to exploit the opposition to these elections by most political leaders in the South. In April 1948, a national conference was convened in the northern capital, Pyongyang, to try to stave off the division of the nation. Kim Il-sung appeared with Ri's main southern opponents, including the southern communist leader Park Hon-young.
이번 우리 합이 가지는 의의는 우리 정기 남쪽 반도를 미대국주의자들이 자기네의 시도가 노골화되고 있는 조건 하에서.
Two of the main conservative leaders from the south, Kim Gu and Kim Kyu-sik, returned from Pyongyang saying they would boycott the election. They and all but two parties kept away, even though the election gave most people a first vote. Guerrillas raided polling stations, but the police were used for coercion too. General Hodge and the Americans had wanted a wider contest.
I felt that it would have helped the unity of the South if they had, if the moderates had been able to participate in the election, so that really it was a rubber stamp election. As far as I could see in Seoul, where I was, I didn't go out in the countryside. It was conducted fairly enough under these circumstances. I gather in other parts of the country, just in case the wrong people should get votes, that there were the police. There were also student groups that had been organised in the country. I understand, but I didn't see them, to ensure that the right people got the votes. So you couldn't really call the election a fair election, no.
The UN observers visited about 2% of the polling stations and pronounced themselves reasonably satisfied in their report. 3 months later, General Douglas MacArthur, heading the Allied occupation of Japan, flew into Korea for the inauguration of Ri as president on the day that the South formally acquired its independence. Ri claimed to represent the whole country. In the North, there was another claimant to represent the whole nation. Kim Il-sung proclaimed the Democratic People's Republic. It